Hi everyone, I'm Kristen Onamaker. I'm a history teacher and I want to talk to you about how to integrate sources for a DBQ. It's a really valuable skill, not just for AP history classes that you're in, but for English classes that you might have, any other college courses that you might have. When you are using documents, then you need to consider which documents are best to use and why. So let's get started. When you are integrating a source, you have two options. You can either summarize and describe an image, and an image can be a photo, artwork, posters, a chart, a graph, even a map. Or you will be using an excerpt from a piece of text. So in these two examples, we have this information here from the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the U.S. Department of Commerce, and you have all this interesting information. You would need to basically describe what's important. Maybe you'd use some of the numbers and you'd describe the years that are involved. So for example, you might use this information that it was from 2011 to 2021. And if you were just to look at the information here, you would say, okay, well, food services certainly account for a lot. There's a lot of light blue, and then there's a lot of light yellow, and that's food, beverage, and tobacco manufacturing. And what's the point of all this? Well, it's the value added to the United States gross domestic product by agriculture and related industries. So you get a clear picture that food, beverage, and tobacco manufacturing and places that serve these products are the ones that add a lot to the GDP. Now, if you're looking at an excerpt from a text, let's just take one of the most famous texts in U.S. history, the Declaration of Independence. And here's the actual primary source. Thomas Jefferson wrote this. I found it off of the Library of Congress website. All of that information holds no copyrights. So you can use it for this and everything else that you might want to. And in this case, this would be as it was written with annotations. Here's the actual wording that we're all familiar with, but you wouldn't write the entire thing. You would want to take a portion of it for whatever purpose that you might need it for. All right. So what is the purpose of integrating a source? It is to help to prove your thesis or claim. That's the main argument that you're making. Usually you state it in your introductory paragraph. And then the source itself will help to provide evidence that either supports or refutes the claim that you're making, the argument that you've presented. So there are two types of sources beyond the actual examples. There's primary sources and secondary sources. You may have heard this, you may be familiar with it. Primary sources are artifacts that basically were created or produced during the time period you're writing about. It might be from an eyewitness who lived through it or who experienced it. An example might be a diary entry, photographs, interviews, speeches, reports, letters, maps, all of those kinds of things. Now, secondary sources are written works or even artistic works, whatever the case may be, that were produced after the fact, often much later. So it could be textbooks. If a textbook was published in 2022 or 2023 about something that happened during the Revolutionary War or the Civil War, that's a secondary source. There's a lot of time between what happened and now versus a primary source where if somebody was living through one of these wars or the suffrage movement or whatever the case might be. Other examples of secondary sources would be historical books. So historians write books about topics, and that would be a secondary source. There are pictures that were created. Often anniversaries of major events cause people to create pictures. Charts that are created. Graphs, maps, and statues are also things that could be historically important, but they are secondary sources. So here's an example of how to summarize or describe something that would be a chart or that would have statistical information. For example, in this table, we have the selected estimates of unemployment in the United States between 1929 and 1939. And of course, if you're familiar with U.S. history, that means during the Great Depression. So if you are looking at this chart, you're looking at selected estimates. Now, what's interesting about this is that the sources come from a variety of different places: the Alexander Hamilton Institute, the American Federation of Labor, Congress of Industrial Organizations, Robert Nathan, Social Security Bulletin. So a variety of different sources have provided this information. But if you are looking at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is a government agency, probably has the most expansive sets of data, you will see in 1929 that unemployment numbers were around 1.5 million people, because this is in thousands. But by 1932, it's 12 million, right? So it went from 1.5 million to 4.3 million to 8 million, and now we're at 12 million. Well, that is a pretty high number. And then you see that it pretty much stays the same from 1932 to 1939. Now, it does go up and down in 36 and 37, and that's when that's what was called the Roosevelt recession, where things, interestingly, unemployment improved a little bit, but still the numbers are not good in general. And you see this across the board. In any event, the source is the Bureau of Labor Statistics, so that's the government source on that. You always need to know that. All right, so let's pretend that the potential prompt for the question is: analyze whether the United States government was able to offer effective solutions to the problems of the Great Depression. Now, when you say the United States government, that means the three branches of the federal government: the executive, that is the president, the Congress, the legislative branch, and the Supreme Court, which is the judicial branch. And because the Great Depression started in 1929, and Herbert Hoover was the president during that time, and he certainly didn't do that much to change things. And then FDR came in and established the New Deal. So there's some basic context you'd be putting in the introduction, discussing, and have as background material. But then once you get in your body paragraphs, that's where you put your documents, and that's where you integrate them. So let's say you want to use this information to determine whether or not the government was effective at curbing unemployment. So let's say your thesis would be: the United States government was only partially able to provide meaningful solutions to the problems that occurred as a result of the Great Depression. Here's an example of how you would integrate this chart. Unemployment rates increased dramatically between 1931 and 1932 and stayed relatively high until 1939 throughout the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And then you would put document 1 to reference the document. And here's where it says the document name. Sometimes this can be A, B, C, whatever. So then if it was letters, you would say document A, or whatever the case may be. Well, these numbers, meaning these numbers right here, reflect an unemployment rate around 20 to 25%. During these years, FDR and Congress implemented programs which may have prevented even more unemployment. So that means that's referencing the New Deal. All right, so here's an example of a primary source text excerpt. Here's what it says. Document 2. As to the New Deal, I believe that it has been a failure, as it has protected the trusts more than the American people. Today, the poor are poorer and the trusts are richer. Another reason: this is a country that is controlled by trusts. This is a statement made by Dr. M. Santos, interviewed by the U.S. Works Project Administration, which was part of, and the Federal Writers Project, which was part of the U.S. Works Project Administration, or the WPA, circa 1936 to 1939, it should say there. And the source was Library of Congress. Again, with the same prompt and the same thesis and claim, here's an example of how to integrate this. Some people believe the New Deal to have been a failure. A doctor originally born in Cuba, Dr. M. Santos, believed that the New Deal was a failure, quote, because it has protected the trusts more than the American people, end quote. Document 2. Ironically, Dr. Santos made this statement during an interview sponsored by the Federal Writers Project, a New Deal program that was initiated to collect everyday people's views on current events and past topics. One of the most significant contributions of the Federal Writers Project was to interview former slaves. These interviews were critical to the nation's history, which could be considered a worthwhile endeavor and a cultural success. So now, was this an effective solution to have government employees go out and interview people and talk about things and topics such as whether or not even, the New Deal was effective and what slavery was like? Well, first of all, it did employ people, and secondly, we have the records for our historical purposes and reference. Now, did that solve the problems of Great Depression, you'd have to look at the other sources that were provided and go on to discuss. Of course, in general, the contention is among historians that really the New Deal did not necessarily solve all of the economic problems that existed. And in fact, it was World War II that brought the United States out of the Depression. But here's another source from the New York Times, an editorial written in 2021. So this is a secondary source text excerpt. And an editorial is also a secondary source. Now, an editorial in a newspaper could also be a primary source, and that can happen, right? A map could be a primary source or a secondary source. There's all sorts of artifacts and written works that can serve in both capacities, but you have to consider, when was it written? Well, something that was written in 2021 about the New Deal during the 1930s is definitely a secondary source because he did not live through it, at least quite unlikely. And yet, and here's what he wrote in the editorial, and yet the breakthrough of the New Deal, the way it reshaped the nation's politics and transformed the relationship between state and citizens, set the stage for the social revolutions of subsequent decades. The New Deal brought, in Roosevelt's phrasing, the broadening conception of social justice to American life. Again, same potential prompt, thesis and claim. How do you integrate this? The example of document integration. While the New Deal perhaps did not fix all of the nation's problems, it, quote, transformed the relationship between state and citizen, end quote. Prior to the New Deal, the federal government had not been involved in daily lives of the people or in providing a safety net. Under the New Deal, not only did more people have opportunities to work for the federal government, but initiatives like Social Security instituted a measure of financial security that had never existed before. So again, you're building up an argument that yes, the New Deal and other government programs did provide some relief during the Great Depression, but it did not solve the Great Depression, perhaps in an effective way. But it was going to be the breakthrough in terms of providing a different kind of platform for how democracy was seen and the role of state in society, which is all very important. So that would be up to you if you were actually writing this to integrate more sources and come up with a thesis and all that kind of information. But what is most important in this situation is that you understand how to integrate primary sources, secondary sources, and how you would either summarize and describe if you're looking at some sort of image, chart, graph, whatever, versus integrating a piece of text. And remember, when you're integrating a piece of text, you don't want to include too much. All right, so on that note, I just want to say that these sources are available if you're interested in women's history. Here are some that I created for my TPT store, and feel free to visit if you would like to see more about that. Thank you so much for watching.